Manage mentoring for getting started in beekeeping. This is Recovery from a Deadout. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we will review the assets from a hive where the colony did not make it through. The lesson will review what needs to be discarded, what things to look for to correct problems, and what can be carried forward for the installation of a new colony. Recovery from a deadout takes a little know-how. After you finish performing a necropsy, you have questions about what to do with the hive equipment and honeycomb. This lesson is going to walk you through evaluating all the components and provide recommendations for what you should eliminate and what you can keep and put back into service. The first step to recovery is to take a wider view of the equipment that is in service. If there were any problems with the equipment from the initial construction, any vestiges of things that were not right from the beginning, now is the time to correct whatever is there. Starting with getting rid of any old honeycomb that you might have received if you started with a resource from, say, a nucleus hive that introduced foreign frames into your operation. One thing to consider is that the hive equipment was sitting outside during cold winter days when the honeycomb inside was subject to freezing. And well, that's advantageous as freezing the equipment is one of the steps of ridding diseases. Do consider, though, that this is not foolproof, as some things that can harm honeybee colonies can persist even if frozen for extended periods of time. Still, it is advantageous to know that part of your recovery has been accomplished due to the freezing cold. In the next series of slides, we're going to review the resources and make some recommendations of things you should keep and things you should discard. Any frames that contain fully capped honey are reusable and will provide a good start for future colonies. You could also harvest these frames for their contents. Do keep in mind that if you fed your bees, what is under the capping may be sugar water and not proper honey. If you choose to harvest, make sure that you're harvesting genuine honey. Occasionally you will find comb that contains remnants of crystallized sugar. These were likely nectar frames that are dehydrated from the dry winter air, and the residual sugars have crystallized. These are perfectly safe to feed back to the bees. You can place the frames right in a colony and the bees will consume that sugar with no difficulty. It is not uncommon to find frames packed with bee bread. Bee bread is a form of stored pollen as reserved by the bees. While technically feasible to return to the colony, it is commonly recommended that you discard any frames that contain stored pollen. Bees prefer fresh pollen, and quite frankly, it is better for them to have fresh pollen over winter reserved pollen. If fresh pollen is available, which it likely will be in the spring, the bees will pull it out and discard the old pollen anyway. Our recommendation is to remove the comb from the frame and replace it with a fresh sheet of foundation or plastic if that's what you're using. We would also recommend any frames that have remnants of uncapped brood be refreshed with new foundation. Bees that are still under the cappings may be harboring viruses and disease. A new colony could remove those bees with little problem and recycle the sheet of honeycomb, but they would be subject to the potential risk of whatever the deceased larvae are carrying. If the honeycomb has just a few small dots, this might be okay and worth the risk, but really that's your personal preference, your call to make. It is not uncommon to see frames that present with signs of mold or mildew. While that might be off-putting to us, honeybees can readily clean this up and they will not suffer any harmful effects from doing so. Unless you find some extreme cases, these frames can be returned and the bees will clean them up just fine. You know, as with all of this, any frames that you find that has something off about them could be discarded. If you are very risk averse, this again is personal preference. You can put in all clean frames and start your colony on fresh foundation. While examining the interior of a hive, be scrupulous about the honeycomb construction. If there are any frames that present with poorly built out comb, now is the time to pull them and place them on the discard pile. If the bees did not build them well, maybe they have holes in them, they have wonky comb, it's time to get rid of them. Scrape them off or cut out the foundation and have them start from scratch. If you have some that are not fully built out, maybe you could put those in, the bees will finish the job in the early spring, or you can simply give them a new one to start with. It is not customary for honeybees to defecate on the interior of a hive. And while honeybees can clean up small incidental instances, and in some cases you can too if you find an errant spot here or there, maybe you really want to discard this frame. If you find frames that have anything more than incidental deposits of feces, they should be discarded. Remnants of the feces can hold detrimental elements that the bees would pick up as they cleanse the surfaces, and then they would spread that around in the new colony. It is possible that you will have fringe instances where honeycomb has come into contact with some form of pest that has made an incursion to the interior of the hive. An example might be hive equipment where a mouse has taken up residence. In this example, it's not unlikely to think that the mouse has soiled the surroundings. Some of the comb may be impacted, and you can't visibly see that, but the bees would be able to detect it. Honeybees are really sometimes sensitive to honeycomb that has been contaminated, and for this reason, you should evaluate these on a case-by-case basis, and if you have cause for concern, you should eliminate any of the damaged or potentially impacted comb. As mentioned a bit ago, but it's worth stating again, if any old comb has found its way into your operation, and this should be culled at this time. For this course, we consider comb that is older than 3 years old as honeycomb that should be considered for taking out of service. The longer comb is in service, the more it can harbor undesirable elements that could impact your bees. And since we're processing hive equipment where a colony has perished, it only makes sense to be proactive on this measure. One task in Deadout Recovery is discarding the collection of dead bees. Be smart about this, as the bees could be a liability to future live bees if they happen to be harboring viruses and diseases. Collect all your dead bees and discard them properly. Take them out of the apiary and put them in the trash, or distribute them out into nature somewhere far from your apiary where other bees will not come into contact with them. Consider the same treatment while handling any of the honeycomb. Anything that you're culling from your equipment should be protected from exposure to new or existing bees in the environment. As you're processing your equipment, consider its storage and recognize that everything on the interior is not being defended by a live colony. The tiniest remnants of any resources within the comb, honey, pollen, things like that, will provide plenty of food for any type of pest incursion once warmer weather emerges. Take time to consider how you're going to handle the equipment while it's in storage, awaiting redeployment. One thing we recommend is taking your equipment and spreading it out on a sunny day, exposing all of the surfaces to direct sunlight, which will serve in some manner to dry out any moisture and is known to kill off some forms of bacteria that could have formed while the equipment sits dormant. One aside to consider, which is not a common thing to do, but it is an option, is the availability of irradiating your equipment. Regionally, there are programs offered to beekeepers where you can pay to have your equipment irradiated. Consider contacting your local or state beekeeping organizations to see if they're aware of any services being offered in your zone. You could also consider contacting your local state apiarist. Typically, you're going to drive to a collection point and hand over your equipment. They're going to place it on a pallet and take it to a processing facility. The instructions by provider vary, and you'll have to follow whatever their routine is. Now, this isn't a common option, but it's a possible route. And if you find something of serious problems within your hive, or you're struggling with viruses and diseases, you might really want to consider this unusual path before placing your equipment back into service. This is pretty much a catch-all slide. It serves to emphasize the point that if there was anything fundamentally wrong with your equipment as you see listed, when you put it into service, now is the time you can make your corrections. Consider the list on the slide and also how the equipment held up, and take the opportunity to make things right since you don't have live bees in the equipment. To finish the lesson, we want to take a moment to recognize that while this is not the most glamorous work, it is somewhat cathartic as you close the chapter on one book and start the chapter with a clean slate. Taking the proper steps to evaluate your equipment and perform the recommended action gives you the confidence that the equipment you put back into service is ready to serve the next colony, and everything that was involved in this process will only help you to expand your knowledge in your beekeeping practice. As this lesson comes to a close, we complete the series on how to perform hive autopsies and put your equipment back into service. The next lesson is going to focus on honeybee maladies, and that's followed up by the dynamics of swarming and swarm control. If you have any questions, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you at the next lesson.